This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Allan Quatermain by H. Rider Haggard. Chapter 9. Into the Unknown. A week had passed, and we all sat at supper one night in the mission dining room, feeling very much depressed in spirits, for the reason that we were going to say good-bye to our kind friend the Mackenzies, and depart upon our way at dawn on the morrow. Nothing more had been seen or heard of the Masai, and save for a spear or two which had been overlooked and was rusting in the grass, and a few empty cartridges where we had stood outside the wall, it would have been difficult to tell that the old cattle kraal at the foot of the slope had been the scene of so desperate a struggle. Mackenzie was, thanks chiefly to his being so temperate a man, rapidly recovering from his wound, and could get about on a pair of crutches, and as for the other wounded men, one had died of gangrene, the rest were in a fair way to recovery. Mr Mackenzie's caravan of men had also returned from the coast, so that the station was now amply garrisoned. Under these circumstances we concluded, warm and pressing as were the invitations for us to stay, that it was time to move on, first to Mount Kenia, and thence into the unknown, in search of the mysterious white race which we had set our hearts on discovering. This time we were going to progress by means of the humble but useful donkey, of which we had collected no less than a dozen, to carry our goods and chattels, and if necessary ourselves. We had now but 2 Wakwafis left for servants, and found it quite impossible to get other natives to venture with us into the unknown parts we proposed to explore, and small blame to them. After all, as Mr Mackenzie said, it was odd that 3 men, each of whom possessed many of those things that are supposed to make life worth living, health, sufficient means, and position, etc., should from their own pleasure start out upon a wild goose chase, from which the chances were they would never return. But then that is what Englishmen are, adventurers to the backbone, and all our magnificent muster roll of colonies, each of which will in time become a great nation, testify to the extraordinary value of the spirit of adventure, which at first sight looks like a mild form of lunacy. Adventurer, he that goes out to meet whatever may come. Well, that is what we all do in the world one way or another, and speaking for myself, I am proud of the title, because it implies a brave heart and a trust in Providence. Besides, when many and many a noted Croesus, at whose feet the people worship, and many a time-serving and word-coining politician are forgotten, the names of those grand-hearted old adventurers who have made England what she is will be remembered and taught with love and pride to little children whose unshaped spirits yet slumber in the womb of centuries to be. Not that we 3 can expect to be numbered with such as these, yet have we done something, enough, perhaps, to throw a garment over the nakedness of our folly. That evening, whilst we were sitting on the veranda, smoking a pipe before turning in, who should come up to us but Alphonse, and with a magnificent bow announced his wish for an interview. Being requested to fire away, he explained at some length that he was anxious to attach himself to our party, a statement that astonished me not a little, knowing what a coward the little man was. The reason, however, soon appeared. Mr Mackenzie was going down to the coast, and thence on to England. Now if he went down country, Alphonse was persuaded that he would be seized, extradited, sent to France, and to penal servitude. This was the idea that haunted him, as King Charles's head haunted Mr. Dick, and he brooded over it till his imagination exaggerated the danger 10 times. As a matter of fact, the probability is that his offence against the laws of his country had long ago been forgotten, and that he would have been allowed to pass unmolested anywhere except in France. But he could not be got to see this. Constitutional coward as the little man was, he infinitely preferred to face the certain hardships and great risks and dangers of such an expedition as ours than to expose himself, notwithstanding his intense longing for his native land, to the possible scrutiny of a police officer, which is, after all, only another exemplification of the truth that, to the majority of men, a far-off foreseen danger, however shadowy, is much more terrible than the most serious present emergency. After listening to what he had to say, we consulted among ourselves, and finally agreed, with Mr Mackenzie's knowledge and consent, to accept his offer. To begin with, we were very short-handed, and Alphonse was a quick, active fellow who could turn his hand to anything. And cook! Ah, he could cook. I believe that he would have made a palatable dish of those gaiters of his heroic grandfather which he was so fond of talking about. Then he was a good-tempered little man, and merry as a monkey, while his pompous, vainglorious talk was a source of infinite amusement to us. And what is more, he never bore malice. Of course, his being so pronounced a coward was a great drawback to him, but now that we knew his weakness, we could more or less guard against it. So after warning him of the undoubted risks he was exposing himself to, we told him that we would accept his offer on condition that he would promise implicit obedience to our orders. We also promised to give him wages at the rate of £10 a month should he ever return to a civilized country to receive them. To all of this he agreed with alacrity, and retired to write a letter to his Annette, which Mr Mackenzie promised to post when he got down country. He read it to us afterwards, Sir Henry translating, and a wonderful composition it was. I am sure the depth of his devotion and the narration of his sufferings in a barbarous country, far, far from thee, Annette, for whose adored sake I endure such sorrow, ought to have touched the feelings of the stoniest-hearted chambermaid. Well, the morrow came, and by 7 o'clock the donkeys were all loaded, and the time of parting was at hand. It was a melancholy business, especially saying good-bye to dear little Flossie. She and I were great friends, and often used to have talks together, but her nerves had never got over the shock of that awful night when she lay in the power of those bloodthirsty Masai. "Oh, Mr Quatermain," she cried, throwing her arms round my neck and bursting into tears, "I can't bear to say good-bye to you. I wonder when we shall meet again." "I don't know, my dear little girl," I said. "I am at one end of life and you are at the other. I have but a short time before me at best, and most things lie in the past, but I hope that for you there are many long and happy years, and everything lies in the future. By and by you will grow into a beautiful woman, Flossie, and all this wild life will be like a far-off dream to you. But I hope, even if we never do meet again, that you will think of your old friend and remember what I say to you now. Always try to be good, my dear, and to do what is right rather than what happens to be pleasant, for in the end, whatever sneering people may say, what is good and what is happy are the same. Be unselfish and whenever you can, give a helping hand to others, for the world is full of suffering, my dear, and to alleviate it is the noblest end that we can set before us. If you do that, you will become a sweet and God-fearing woman, and make many people's lives a little brighter, and then you will not have lived, as so many of your sex do, in vain. And now I have given you a lot of old-fashioned advice, and so I'm going to give you something to sweeten it with. You see this little piece of paper? It is what is called a cheque. When we are gone, give it to your father with this note. Not before, mind. You will marry one day, my dear little Flossie, and it is to buy you a wedding present which you are to wear, and your daughter after you, if you have one, in remembrance of Hunter Quatermain. Poor little Flossie cried very much, and gave me a lock of her bright hair in return, which I still have. The cheque I gave her was for £1,000, which, being now well off, and having no calls upon me except those of charity, I could well afford. And in the note I directed her father to invest it for her in government security, and when she married or came of age, to buy her the best diamond necklace he could get for the money and accumulated interest. I chose diamonds because I think that now that King Solomon's mines are lost to the world, their price will never be much lower than it is at present, so that if in after life she should ever be in pecuniary difficulties, she will be able to turn them into money. Well, at last we got off, after much hand-shaking, hat-waving, and also farewell saluting from the natives, Alphonse weeping copiously, for he has a warm heart, at parting with his master and mistress, and I was not sorry for it at all, for I hate those goodbyes. Perhaps the most affecting thing of all was to witness Umslopogaas's distress at parting with Flossie, for whom the grim old warrior had conceived a strong affection. He used to say that she was as sweet to see as the only star on a dark night, and was never tired of loudly congratulating himself on having killed the Lygonani who had threatened to murder her. And that was the last we saw of the pleasant mission house, a true oasis in the desert, and of European civilization. But I often think of the Mackenzies, and wonder how they got down country, and if they are now safe and well in England, and will ever see these words. Dear little Flossie, I wonder how she fares there, where there are no black folk to do her imperious bidding, and no sky-piercing, snow-clad Kenya for her to look at when she gets up in the morning. And so goodbye to Flossie. After leaving the mission house we made our way, comparatively unmolested, past the base of Mount Kenya, which the Masai call Donyo Egger, or the Speckled Mountain, on account of the black patches of rock that appear upon its mighty spire, where the sides are too precipitous to allow of the snow lying on them. Then on past the lonely Lake Baringo, where one of our two remaining Askari, having unfortunately trodden on a puff adder, died of snake bite, in spite of all our efforts to save him. Thence we proceeded a distance of about 150 miles to another magnificent snow-clad mountain called Lekakisera, which has never, to the best of my belief, been visited before by a European, but which I cannot now stop to describe. There we rested a fortnight, and then started out into the trackless and uninhabited forest of a vast district called Elgumi. In this forest alone there are more elephants than I ever met with or heard of before. The mighty mammals literally swarm there, entirely unmolested by man, and only kept down by the natural law that prevents any animals increasing beyond the capacity of the country they inhabit to support them. Needless to say, however, we did not shoot many of them, first because we could not afford to waste ammunition, of which our stock was getting perilously low, a donkey loaded with it having been swept away in fording a flooded river, and secondly because we could not carry away the ivory and did not wish to kill for the mere sake of slaughter. So we let the great beasts be, only shooting one or two in self-protection. In this district the elephants, being unacquainted with the hunter and his tender mercies, would allow one to walk up to within 20 yards of them in the open, while they stood, with their great ears cocked for all the world like puzzled and gigantic puppy dogs, and stared at that new and extraordinary phenomenon, man. Occasionally, when the inspection did not prove satisfactory, the staring ended in a trumpet and a charge, but this did not often happen. When it did, we had to use our rifles. Nor were elephants the only wild beasts in the great Elkumi forest. All sorts of large game abounded, including lions, confound them. I have always hated the sight of a lion since one bit my leg and lamed me for life. As a consequence, another thing that abounded was the dreadful tsetse fly, whose bite is death to domestic animals. Donkeys have, together with man, hitherto been supposed to enjoy a peculiar immunity from its attacks, but all I have to say, whether it was on account of their poor condition or because the tsetse in those parts is more poisonous than usual, I do not know, but ours succumbed to its onslaught. Fortunately, however, that was not till 2 months or so after the bites had been inflicted, when suddenly, after a 2 days' cold rain, they all died, and on removing the skins of several of them, I found the long yellow streaks upon the flesh which are characteristic of death from bites from the tsetse, marking the spot where the insect had inserted his proboscis. On emerging from the great Elkumi forest, we, still steering northwards, in accordance with the information Mr Mackenzie had collected from the unfortunate wanderer who reached him only to die so tragically, struck the base in due course of the large lake called Laga by the natives, which is about 50 miles long by 20 broad, and of which it may be remembered he made mention. Thence we pushed on nearly a month's journey over great rolling uplands, something like those in the Transvaal, but diversified by patches of bush country. All this time we were continually ascending, at the rate of about 100 feet every 10 miles. Indeed, the country was on a slope which appeared to terminate at a mass of snow-tipped mountains, for which we were steering, and where we learnt the second lake of which the wanderer had spoken as the lake without a bottom was situated. At length we arrived there, and having ascertained that there was a large lake on top of the mountains, ascended 3,000 feet more till we came to a precipitous cliff or edge, to find a great sheet of water some 20 miles square, lying 1,500 feet below us, and evidently occupying an extinct volcanic crater or craters of vast extent. Perceiving villages on the border of this lake, we descended with great difficulty through forests of pine trees, which now clothe the precipitous sides of the crater, and were well received by the people, a simple, unwarlike folk who had never seen or even heard of a white man before, and treated us with great reverence and kindness, supplying us with as much food and milk as we could eat and drink. This wonderful and beautiful lake lay, according to our aneroid, at a height of no less than 11,450 feet above sea level, and its climate was quite cold and not at all unlike that of England. Indeed, for the first 3 days of our stay there we saw little or nothing of the scenery on account of an unmistakable Scotch mist which prevailed. It was this rain that set the tsetse poison working in our remaining donkeys, so that they all died. This disaster left us in a very awkward position, as we had now no means of transport whatever, though on the other hand we had not much to carry. Ammunition, too, was very short, amounting to but 150 rounds of rifle cartridges and some 50 shotgun cartridges. How to get on we did not know. Indeed, it seemed to us that we had about reached the end of our tether. Even if we had been inclined to abandon the object of our search, which, shadow as it was by no means the case, it was ridiculous to think of forcing our way back some several hundred miles to the coast in our present plight. So we came to the conclusion that the only thing to be done was to stop where we were, the natives being so well disposed and food plentiful, for the present, and abide events, and try to collect information as to the countries beyond. Accordingly, having purchased a capital log canoe, large enough to hold us all and our baggage, from the headman of the village we were staying in, presenting him with 3 empty cold-drawn brass cartridges by way of payment, with which he was perfectly delighted, we set out to make a tour of the lake in order to find the most favourable place to make a camp. As we did not know if we should return to this village, we put all our gear into the canoe, and also a quarter of cooked waterbuck, which when young is delicious eating, and off we set, natives having already gone before us in light canoes to warn the inhabitants of the other villages of our approach. As we were puddling leisurely along, Good remarked upon the extraordinary deep blue colour of the water, and said that he understood from the natives, who were great fishermen, fish, indeed, being their principal food, that the lake was supposed to be wonderfully deep, and to have a hole at the bottom through which the water escaped and put out some great fire that was raging below. I pointed out to him that what he had heard was probably a legend arising from a tradition among the people which dated back to the time when one of the extinct parasitic volcanic cones was in activity. We saw several round the borders of the lake which had no doubt been working at a period long subsequent to the volcanic death of the central crater which now formed the bed of the lake itself. When it finally became extinct, the people would imagine that the water from the lake had run down and put out the big fire below, more especially as, though it was constantly fed by streams running from the snow-tipped peaks about, there was no visible exit to it. The farther shore of the lake we found, on approaching it, to consist of a vast perpendicular wall of rock, which held the water without any intermediate sloping bank as elsewhere. Accordingly, we paddled parallel with this precipice, at a distance of about 100 paces from it, shaping our course for the end of the lake where we knew there was a large village. As we went, we began to pass a considerable accumulation of floating rushes, weeds, boughs of trees, and other rubbish, brought, Good supposed, to this spot by some current, which he was much puzzled to account for. While we were speculating about this, Sir Henry pointed out a flock of large white swans which were feeding on the drift some little way ahead of us. Now I had already noticed swans flying about this lake, and having never come across them before in Africa, was exceedingly anxious to obtain a specimen. I had questioned the natives about them, and learnt that they came from over the mountain, always arriving at certain periods of the year in the early morning, when it was very easy to catch them on account of their exhausted condition. I also asked them what country they came from, when they shrugged their shoulders and said that on top of the great black precipice was stony, inhospitable land, and beyond that were mountains with snow and full of wild beasts where no people lived, and beyond the mountains were hundreds of miles of dense thorn forest, so thick that even the elephants could not get through it, much less men. Next I asked them if they had ever heard of white people like ourselves living on the farther side of the mountains and the thorn forest, whereat they laughed. But afterwards a very old woman came and told me that when she was a little girl her grandfather had told her that in his youth his grandfather, had crossed the desert and the mountains, and pierced the thorn forest, and seen a white people who lived in stone kraals beyond. Of course, as this took the tale back some 250 years, the information was very indefinite, but still there it was again, and on thinking it over I grew firmly convinced that there was some truth in all these rumours, and equally firmly determined to solve the mystery. Little did I guess in what an almost miraculous way my desire was to be gratified. Well, we set to work to stalk the swans, which kept drawing as they fed nearer and nearer to the precipice, and at last we pushed the canoe under shelter of a patch of drift within 40 yards of them. Sir Henry had the shotgun loaded with No. 1, and waiting for a chance got two in a line, and firing at their necks killed them both. Up rose the rest, 30 or more of them, with a mighty splashing, and as they did so he gave them the other barrel. Down came one fellow with a broken wing, and I saw the leg of another drop and a few feathers start out of his back, but he went on quite strong. Up went the swans, circling ever higher till at last they were mere specks level with the top of the frowning precipice, when I saw them form into a triangle and head off for the unknown northeast. Meanwhile we had picked up our two dead ones, and beautiful birds they were, weighing not less than about 30 pounds each, and were chasing the winged one, which had scrambled over a mass of driftweed into a pool of clear water beyond. Finding a difficulty in forcing the canoe through the rubble, I told our only remaining Wakwafi servant, whom I knew to be an excellent swimmer, to jump over, dive under the drift, and catch him, knowing that as there were no crocodiles in this lake he could come to no harm. Entering into the fun of the thing, the man obeyed, and was soon dodging about after the winged swan in fine style, getting gradually nearer to the rock wall against which the water washed as he did so. Presently he gave up swimming after the swan, and began to cry out that he was being carried away, and indeed we saw that, though he was swimming with all his strength towards us, he was being drawn slowly to the precipice. With a few desperate strokes of our paddles we pushed the canoe through the crust of drift and rowed towards the man as hard as we could, but fast as we went he was drawn faster to the rock. Suddenly I saw that before us, just rising 18 inches or so above the surface of the lake, was what looked like the top of the arch of a submerged cave or railway tunnel. Evidently, from the watermark on the rock several feet above it, it was generally entirely submerged, but there had been a dry season, and the cold had prevented the snow from melting as freely as usual, so the lake was low and the arch showed. Towards this arch our poor servant was being sucked with frightful rapidity. He was not more than 10 fathoms from it, and we were about 20 when I saw it, and with little help from us the canoe flew along after him. He struggled bravely, and I thought that we should have saved him, when suddenly I perceived an expression of despair come upon his face, and there before our eyes he was sucked down into the cruel swirling blue depths and vanished. At the same moment I felt our canoe seized as with a mighty hand, and propelled with resistless force towards the rock. We realized our danger now, and rowed, or rather paddled, furiously in our attempt to get out of the vortex. In vain. In another second we were flying straight for the arch like an arrow, and I thought that we were lost. Luckily I retained sufficient presence of mind to shout out, instantly setting the example by throwing myself into the bottom of the canoe, "Down on your faces, down!" and the others had the sense to take the hint. In another instant there was a grinding noise, and the boat was pushed down till the water began to trickle over the sides, and I thought that we were gone. But no, suddenly the grinding ceased, and we could again feel the canoe flying along. I turned my head a little, I dared not lift it, and looked up. By the feeble light that yet reached the canoe, I could make out that a dense arch of rock hung just over our heads, and that was all. In another minute I could not even see as much as that, for the faint light had merged into shadow, and the shadows had been swallowed up in darkness, utter and complete. For an hour or so we lay there, not daring to lift our heads for fear lest the brains should be dashed out of them, and scarcely able to speak even, on account of the noise of the rushing water which drowned our voices. Not indeed that we had much inclination to speak, seeing that we were overwhelmed by the awfulness of our position and the imminent fear of instant death, either by being dashed against the sides of the cavern, or on a rock, or being sucked down in the raging waters, or perhaps asphyxiated by want of air. All of these and many other modes of death presented themselves to my imagination as I lay at the bottom of the canoe, listening to the swirl of the hurrying waters which ran whither we knew not. One only other sound could I hear, and that was Alphonse's intermittent howl of terror coming from the centre of the canoe, and even that seemed faint and unnatural. Indeed, the whole thing overpowered my brain, and I began to believe that I was the victim of some ghastly spirit-shaking nightmare. End of chapter 9. LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Allan Quatermain by H. Rider Haggard. Chapter 10. The Rose of Fire. On we flew, drawn by the mighty current, till at last I noticed that the sound of the water was not half so deafening as it had been, and concluded that this must be because there was more room for the echoes to disperse in. I could now hear Alphonse's howls much more distinctly. They were made up of the oddest mixture of invocations to the Supreme Power and the name of his beloved Annette that it is possible to conceive, and, in short, though their evident earnestness saved them from profanity, were, to say the least, very remarkable. Taking up a paddle, I managed to drive it into his ribs, whereon he, thinking that the end had come, howled louder than ever. Then I slowly and cautiously raised myself on my knees and stretched my hand upwards, but could touch no roof. Next I took the paddle and lifted it above my head as high as I could, but with the same result. I also thrust it out laterally to the right and left, but could touch nothing except water. Then I bethought me that there was in the boat, amongst our other remaining possessions, a bull's-eye lantern and a tin of oil. I groped about and found it, and having a match on me, carefully lit it, and as soon as the flame had got a hold of the wick I turned it on down the boat. As it happened, the first thing the light lit on was the white and scared face of Alphonse, who, thinking that it was all over at last, and that he was witnessing a preliminary celestial phenomenon, gave a terrific yell, and was with difficulty reassured with the paddle. As for the other three, Good was lying on the flat of his back, his eyeglass still fixed in his eye, and gazing blankly into the upper darkness. Sir Henry had his head resting on the thwarts of the canoe, and with his hand was trying to test the speed of the water. But when the beam of light fell upon old Umslopogaas, I could really have laughed. I think I have said that we had put a roast quarter of waterbuck into the canoe. Well, it so happened that when we all prostrated ourselves to avoid being swept out of the boat and into the water by the rock roof, Umslopogaas's head had come down uncommonly near this roast buck, and so soon as he had recovered a little from the first shock of our position, it occurred to him that he was hungry. Thereupon he coolly cut off a chop with Inkosi-kaas, and was now employed in eating it with every appearance of satisfaction. As he afterward explained, he thought that he was going on a long journey, and preferred to start on a full stomach. It reminded me of the people who are going to be hanged, and who are generally reported in the English daily papers to have made an excellent breakfast. As soon as the others saw that I had managed to light the lamp, we bundled Alphonse into the farther end of the canoe with a threat which calmed him down wonderfully, that if he would insist upon making the darkness hideous with his cries, we would put him out of suspense by sending him to join the Wakwafi and wait for Annette in another sphere, and began to discuss the situation as well as we could. First, however, at Good's suggestion, we bound 2 paddles mast fashion in the bows, so that they might give us warning against any sudden lowering of the roof of the cave or waterway. It was clear to us that we were in an underground river, or as Alphonse defined it, main drain, which carried off the superfluous waters of the lake. Such rivers are well known to exist in many parts of the world, but it has not often been the evil fortune of explorers to travel by them. That the river was wide we could clearly see, for the light from the bull's-eye lantern failed to reach from shore to shore, although occasionally, when the current swept us either to one side or the other, we could distinguish the rock wall of the tunnel, which, as far as we could make out, appeared to arch about 25 feet above our heads. As for the current itself, it ran, Good estimated, at least 8 knots, and fortunately for us was, as is usual, fiercest in the middle of the stream. Still, our first act was to arrange that one of us, with the lantern and a pole there was in the canoe, should always be in the bows, ready, if possible, to prevent us from being stove in against the side of the cave or any projecting rock. Umslopogaas, having already dined, took the first turn. This was absolutely, with one exception, all that we could do towards preserving our safety. The exception was that another of us took up a position in the stern with a paddle, by means of which it was possible to steer the canoe more or less and to keep her from the sides of the cave. These matters attended to, we made a somewhat sparing meal off the cold buck's meat, for we did not know how long it might have to last us, and then, feeling in rather better spirits, I gave my opinion that, serious as it undoubtedly was, I did not consider our position altogether without hope, unless indeed the natives were right and the river plunged straight down into the bowels of the earth. If not, it was clear that it must emerge somewhere, probably on the other side of the mountains, and in that case all we had to think of was to keep ourselves alive till we got there, wherever there might be. But, of course, as Good lugubriously pointed out, on the other hand we might fall victims to 100 unsuspected horrors, or the river might go on winding away inside the earth till it dried up, in which case our fate would indeed be an awful one. "Well, let us hope for the best and prepare ourselves for the worst," said Sir Henry, who is always cheerful and even-spirited, a very tower of strength in the time of trouble. "We have come out of so many queer scrapes together that somehow I almost fancy we shall come out of this," he added. This was excellent advice, and we proceeded to take it each in our separate way, that is, except Alphonse, who had by now sunk into a sort of terrified stupor. Good was at the helm and Umslopogaas in the bows, so there was nothing left for Sir Henry and myself to do except to lie down in the canoe and think. It certainly was a curious, and indeed almost a weird, position to be placed in, rushing along as we were through the bowels of the earth, borne on the bosom of a Stygian river, something after the fashion of souls being ferried by Charon, as Curtis said. And how dark it was! The feeble ray from our little lamp did but serve to show the darkness. There in the bows sat old Umslopogaas, like Pleasure in the poem. End note. Mr. Allan Quatermain misquotes. Pleasure sat at the helm. Editor. Watchful and untiring, the pole ready to his hand, and behind in the shadow I could just make out the form of Good peering forward at the ray of light in order to make out how to steer with the paddle that he held and now and again dipped into the water. Well, well, thought I, you have come in search of adventures, Allan, my boy, and you have certainly got them. At your time of life, too. You ought to be ashamed of yourself. But somehow you are not, and awful as it all is, perhaps you will pull through after all. And if you don't, why, you cannot help it, you see, and when all's said and done, an underground river will make a very appropriate burying place. At first, however, I am bound to say that the strain upon the nerves was very great. It is trying to the coolest and most experienced person not to know from 1 hour to another if he has 5 minutes more to live, but there is nothing in this world that one cannot get accustomed to, and in time we began to get accustomed even to that. And after all, our anxiety, though no doubt natural, was, strictly speaking, illogical, seeing that we never know what is going to happen to us the next minute, even when we sit in a well-drained house with 2 policemen patrolling under the window, nor how long we have to live. It is all arranged for us, my sons, so what is the use of bothering? It was nearly midday when we made our dive into darkness, and we had set our watch, Good and Umslopogaas, at 2, having agreed that it should be of a duration of 5 hours. At 7 o'clock, accordingly, Sir Henry and I went on, Sir Henry at the bow and I at the stern, and the other 2 lay down and went to sleep. For 3 hours all went well, Sir Henry only finding it necessary once to push us off from the side, and I that but little steering was required to keep us straight, as the violent current did all that was needed, though occasionally the canoe showed a tendency which had to be guarded against to veer and travel broadside on. What struck me as the most curious thing about this wonderful river was, how did the air keep fresh? It was muggy and thick, no doubt, but still not sufficiently so to render it bad or even remarkably unpleasant. The only explanation that I can suggest is that the water of the lake had sufficient air in it to keep the atmosphere of the tunnel from absolute stagnation, this air being given out as it proceeded on its headlong way. Of course, I only give the solution of the mystery for what it is worth, which perhaps is not much. When I had been for 3 hours or so at the helm, I began to notice a decided change in the temperature, which was getting warmer. At first I took no notice of it, but when, at the expiration of another half-hour, I found that it was getting hotter and hotter, I called to Sir Henry and asked him if he noticed it, or if it was only my imagination. "Noticed it?" he answered. "I should think so. I am in a sort of Turkish bath." Just about then the others woke up gasping, and were obliged to begin to discard their clothes. Here Umslopogaas had the advantage, for he did not wear any to speak of, except a mocha. Hotter it grew, and hotter yet, till at last we could scarcely breathe, and the perspiration poured out of us. Half an hour more, and though we were all now stark naked, we could hardly bear it. The place was like an antechamber of the infernal regions proper. I dipped my hand into the water and drew it out almost with a cry. It was nearly boiling. We consulted a little thermometer we had. The mercury stood at 123 degrees. From the surface of the water rose a dense cloud of steam. Alphonse groaned out that we were already in purgatory, which indeed we were, though not in the sense that he meant it. Sir Henry suggested that we must be passing near the seat of some underground volcanic fire, and I am inclined to think, especially in light of what subsequently occurred, that he was right. Our sufferings for some time after this really passed my powers of description. We no longer perspired, for all the perspiration had been sweated out of us. We simply lay in the bottom of the boat, which we were now physically incapable of directing, feeling like hot embers, and I fancy undergoing very much the same sensations that the poor fish do when they are dying on land, namely that of slow suffocation. Our skins began to crack, and the blood to throb in our heads like the beating of a steam engine. This had been going on for some time, when suddenly the river turned a little, and I heard Sir Henry call out from the bows in a hoarse, startled voice, and looking up saw a most wonderful and awful thing. About half a mile ahead of us, and a little to the left of the centre of the stream, which we could now see was about 90 feet broad, a huge pillar-like jet of almost white flame rose from the surface of the water and sprang 50 feet into the air, when it struck the roof and spread out some 40 feet in diameter, falling back in curved sheets of fire shaped like the petals of a full-blown rose. Indeed, this awful gas jet resembled nothing so much as a great flaming flower rising out of the black water. Below was the straight stalk, a foot or more thick, and above the dreadful bloom. And as for the fearfulness of it and its fierce and awesome beauty, who can describe it? Certainly I cannot. Although we were now some 500 yards away, it, notwithstanding the steam, lit up the whole cavern as clear as day, and we could see that the roof was here about 40 feet above us, and washed perfectly smooth with water. The rock was black, and here and there I could make out long shining lines of ore running through it like great veins, but of what metal they were I know not. On we rushed towards this pillar of fire, which gleamed fiercer than any furnace ever lit by man. "Keep the boat to the right, Quatermain, to the right!" shouted Sir Henry, and a minute afterwards I saw him fall forward senseless. Alphonse had already gone. Good was the next to go. There they lay as though dead. Only Umslopogaas and I kept our senses. We were within 50 yards of it now, and I saw the Zulu's head fall forward on his hands. He had gone too, and I was alone. I could not breathe. The fierce heat dried me up. For yards and yards round the great rose of fire the rock roof was red hot. The wood of the boat was almost burning. I saw the feathers on one of the dead swans began to twist and shrivel up, but I would not give in. I knew that if I did, we should pass within 3 or 4 yards of the gas jet and perish miserably. I set the paddle so as to turn the canoe as far from it as possible, and held on grimly. My eyes seemed to be bursting from my head, and through my closed lids I could see the fierce light. We were nearly opposite now. It roared like all the fires of hell, and the water boiled furiously around it. 5 seconds more. We were past. I heard the roar behind me. Then I too fell senseless. The next thing that I recollect is feeling a breath of air upon my face. My eyes opened with great difficulty. I looked up. Far, far above me there was light, though around me was great gloom. Then I remembered and looked. The canoe still floated down the river, and in the bottom of it lay the naked forms of my companions. Were they dead, I wondered? Was I left alone in this awful place? I knew not. Next I became conscious of a burning thirst. I put my hand over the edge of the boat into the water and drew it up again with a cry. No wonder, nearly all the skin was burnt off the back of it. The water, however, was cold, or nearly so, and I drank pints and splashed myself all over. My body seemed to suck up the fluid as one may see a brick wall suck up rain after a drought, but where I was burnt the touch of it caused intense pain. Then I bethought myself of the others, and dragging myself towards them with difficulty, I sprinkled them with water, and to my joy they began to recover. Umslopogaas first, then the others. Next they drank, absorbing water like so many sponges. Then, feeling chilly, a queer contrast to our recent sensations, we began as best we could to get into our clothes. As we did so, Good pointed to the port side of the canoe. It was all blistered with heat, and in places actually charred. Had it been built like our civilized boats, Good said that the planks would certainly have warped and let in enough water to sink us, but fortunately it was dug out of the soft willowy wood of a single great tree, and had sides nearly 3 inches and a bottom 4 inches thick. What that awful flame was we never discovered, but I suppose that there was at this spot a crack or hole in the bed of the river through which a vast volume of gas forced its way from its volcanic home in the bowels of the earth towards the upper air. How it first became ignited is, of course, impossible to say. Probably, I should think, from some spontaneous explosion of mephitic gases. As soon as we had got some things together, and shaken ourselves together a little, we set to work to make out where we were now. I have said that there was light above, and on examination we found that it came from the sky. Our river that was, Sir Henry said, a literal realization of the wild vision of the poet, where Alph the sacred river ran through caverns measureless to man, down to a sunless sea, was no longer underground, but was running on its darksome way, not now through caverns measureless to man, but between two frightful cliffs which cannot have been less than 2,000 feet high. So high were they indeed that though the sky was above us, where we were was dense gloom, not darkness indeed, but the gloom of a room closely shuttered in the daytime. Up on either side rose the great straight cliffs, grim and forbidding, till the eye grew dizzy with trying to measure their sheer height. The little space of sky that marked where they ended lay like a thread of blue upon their soaring blackness, which was unrelieved by any tree or creeper. Here and there, however, grew ghostly patches of a long grey lichen, hanging motionless to the rock as the white beard to the chin of a dead man. It seemed as though only the dregs or heavier part of the light had sunk to the bottom of this awful place. No bright-winged sunbeam could fall so low. They died far, far above our heads. By the river's edge was a little shore, formed of round fragments of rock washed into this shape by the constant action of water, and giving the place the appearance of being strewn with thousands of fossil cannonballs. Evidently, when the water of the underground river is high, there is no beach at all, or very little, between the border of the stream and the precipitous cliffs, but now there was a space of 7 or 8 yards. And here on this beach we determined to land, in order to rest ourselves a little after all that we had gone through, and to stretch our limbs. It was a dreadful place, but it would give an hour's respite from the terrors of the river, and also allow of our repacking and arranging the canoe. Accordingly we selected what looked like a favourable spot, and with some little difficulty managed to beach the canoe and scramble out onto the round, inhospitable pebbles. "My word," called out Good, who was on shore the first, "what an awful place! It's enough to give one a fit," and he laughed. Instantly a thundering voice took up his words, magnifying them 100 times. "Give one a fit! Ho, ho, ho! A fit! Ho, ho, ho!" answered another voice in wild accents from far up the cliff. "A fit! A fit! A fit!" chimed in voice after voice, each flinging the words to and fro with shouts of awful laughter to the invisible lips of the other, till the whole place echoed with the words and with shrieks of fiendish merriment, which at last ceased as suddenly as they had begun. "Oh, mon Dieu!" yelled Alphonse, startled quite out of such self-command as he possessed. "Mon Dieu! Mon Dieu! Mon Dieu!" The titanic echoes thundered, shrieked, and wailed in every conceivable tone. "Ah," said Umslopogaas calmly, "I clearly perceive that devils live here. Well, the place looks like it." I tried to explain to him that the cause of all the hubbub was a very remarkable and interesting echo, but he would not believe it. "Ah," he said, "I know an echo when I hear one. There was one lived opposite my kraal in Zululand, and the Itombes (maidens) used to talk with it. But if what we hear is a full-grown echo, mine at home can only have been a baby. No, no, they are devils up there. But I don't think much of them, though," he added, taking a pinch of snuff. "They can copy what one says, but they don't seem to be able to talk on their own account, and they dare not show their faces," and he relapsed into silence and apparently paid no further attention to such contemptible fiends. After this we found it necessary to keep our conversation down to a whisper, for it was really unbearable to have every word one uttered tossed to and fro like a tennis ball, as precipice called to precipice. But even our whispers ran up the rocks in mysterious murmurs till at last they died away in long-drawn sighs of sound. Echoes are delightful and romantic things, but we had more than enough of them in that dreadful gulf. As soon as we had settled ourselves a little on the round stones, we went on to wash and dress our burns as well as we could. As we had but a little oil for the lantern, we could not spare any for this purpose, so we skinned one of the swans and used the fat off its breast, which proved an excellent substitute. Then we repacked the canoe, and finally began to take some food, of which I need scarcely say we were in need, for our insensibility had endured for many hours, and it was, as our watches showed, midday. Accordingly we seated ourselves in a circle, and were soon engaged in discussing our cold meat with such appetite as we could muster, which in my case at any rate was not much, as I felt sick and faint after my sufferings of the previous night, and had besides a racking headache. It was a curious meal. The gloom was so intense that we could scarcely see the way to cut our food and convey it to our mouths. Still we got on pretty well till I happened to look behind me, my attention being attracted by a noise of something crawling over the stones, and perceived sitting upon a rock in my immediate rear a huge species of black freshwater crab, only it was 5 times the size of any crab I ever saw. This hideous and loathsome-looking animal had projecting eyes that seemed to glare at one, very long and flexible antennae, or feelers, and gigantic claws. Nor was I especially favoured with its company. From every quarter dozens of these horrid brutes were creeping up, drawn I suppose by the smell of the food, from between the round stones and out of holes in the precipice. Some were already quite close to us. I stared quite fascinated by the unusual sight, and as I did so I saw one of the beasts stretch out its huge claw and give the unsuspecting Good such a nip behind that he jumped up with a howl, and set the wild echoes flying in sober earnest. Just then, too, another, a very large one, got hold of Alphonse's leg and declined to part with it, and, as may be imagined, a considerable scene ensued. Umslopogaas took his axe and cracked the shell of one with the flat of it, whereupon it set up a horrid screaming which the echoes multiplied 1,000-fold, and began to foam at the mouth, a proceeding that drew hundreds more of its friends out of unsuspected holes and corners. Those on the spot, perceiving that the animal was hurt, fell upon it like creditors on a bankrupt, and literally rent it limb from limb with their huge pincers, and devoured it, using their claws to convey the fragments to their mouths. Seizing whatever weapons were handy, such as stones or paddles, we commenced a war upon the monsters, whose numbers were increasing by leaps and bounds, and whose stench was overpowering. So fast as we cracked their armour, others seized the injured ones and devoured them, foaming at the mouth and screaming as they did so. Nor did the brutes stop at that. When they could, they nipped hold of us, and awful nips they were, or tried to steal the meat. One enormous fellow got hold of the swan we had skinned and began to drag it off. Instantly a score of others flung themselves upon the prey, and then began a ghastly and disgusting scene. How the monsters foamed and screamed and rent the flesh and each other! It was a sickening and unnatural sight, and one that will haunt all of us who saw it till their dying day, enacted as it was in the deep oppressive gloom, and set to the unceasing music of the many-toned, nerve-shaking echoes. Strange as it may seem to say so, there was something so shockingly human about these fiendish creatures. It was as though all the most evil passions and desires of man had got into the shell of a magnified crab and gone mad. They were so dreadfully courageous and intelligent, and they looked as if they understood. The whole scene might have furnished material for another canto of Dante's Inferno, as Curtis said. "I say, you fellows, let's get out of this, or we shall all go off our heads," sung out Good, and we were not slow to take the hint. Pushing the canoe, around which the animals were now crawling by hundreds and making vain attempts to climb, off the rocks, we bundled into it and got out into mid-stream, leaving behind us the fragments of our meal and the screaming, foaming, stinking mass of monsters in full possession of the ground. "Those are the devils of the place," said Umslopogaas with the air of one who has solved a problem, and upon my word I felt almost inclined to agree with him. Umslopogaas's remarks were like his axe, very much to the point. "What's to be done next?" asked Sir Henry blankly. "Drift, I suppose," I answered, and we drifted accordingly. All the afternoon and well into the evening we floated on in the gloom beneath the far-off line of blue sky, scarcely knowing when day ended and night began, for down in that vast gulf the difference was not marked, till at length Good pointed out a star hanging right above us, which, having nothing better to do, we observed with great interest. Suddenly it vanished, the darkness became intense, and a familiar murmuring sound filled the air. "Underground again," I said with a groan, holding up the lamp. Yes, there was no doubt about it. I could just make out the roof. The chasm had come to an end and the tunnel had recommenced. And then there began another long, long night of danger and horror. To describe all its incidents would be too wearisome, so I will simply say that About midnight we struck on a flat projecting rock in midstream, and were as nearly as possible overturned and drowned. However, at last we got off, and went upon the uneven tenor of our way, and so the hours passed till it was nearly 3 o'clock. Sir Henry, Good, and Alphonse were asleep, utterly worn out. Umslopogaas was at the bow with the pole, and I was steering, when I perceived that the rate at which we were travelling had perceptibly increased. Then suddenly I heard Umslopogaas make an exclamation, and next second came a sound as of parting branches, and I became aware that the canoe was being forced through hanging bushes or creepers. Another minute and the breath of sweet open air fanned my face, and I felt that we had emerged from the tunnel and were floating upon clear water. I say felt, for I could see nothing, the darkness being absolutely pitchy, as it often is just before the dawn. But even this could scarcely damp my joy. We were out of that dreadful river, and wherever we might have got to, this at least was something to be thankful for. And so I sat down and inhaled the sweet night air, and waited for the dawn with such patience as I could command. End of chapter 10. LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Allan Quatermain by H. Rider Haggard. Chapter 11. The Frowning City. For an hour or more I sat waiting, Umslopogaas having meanwhile gone to sleep also, till at length the east turned grey, and huge misty shapes moved over the surface of the water like ghosts of long forgotten dawns. They were the vapours rising from their watery bed to greet the sun. Then the grey turned to primrose, and the primrose grew to red. Next, glorious bars of light sprang up across the eastern sky, and through them the radiant messengers of the dawn came speeding upon their arrowy way, scattering the ghostly vapours and awakening the mountains with a kiss as they flew from range to range and longitude to longitude. Another moment and the golden gates were open, and the sun himself came forth as a bridegroom from his chamber, with pomp and glory and a flashing as of 10,000,000 spears, and embraced the night and covered her with brightness, and it was day. But as yet I could see nothing save the beautiful blue sky above, for over the water was a thick layer of mist exactly as though the whole surface had been covered with billows of cotton wool. By degrees, however, the sun sucked up the mists, and then I saw that we were afloat upon a glorious sheet of blue water of which I could not make out the shore. Some 8 or 10 miles behind us, however, there stretched as far as the eye could reach a range of precipitous hills that formed a retaining wall of the lake, and I have no doubt but that it was through some entrance in these hills that the subterranean river found its way into the open water. Indeed, I afterwards ascertained this to be the fact, and it will be some indication of the extraordinary strength and directness of the current of the mysterious river that the canoe, even at this distance, was still answering to it. Presently, too, I, or rather Umslopogaas, who woke up just then, discovered another indication, and a very unpleasant one it was. Perceiving some whitish object upon the water, Umslopogaas called my attention to it, and with a few strokes of the paddle brought the canoe to the spot, whereupon we discovered that the object was the body of a man, floating face downwards. This was bad enough, but imagine my horror when Umslopogaas, having turned him onto his back with the paddle, we recognized in the sunken features the lineaments of, whom do you suppose? None other than our poor servant, who had been sucked down 2 days before in the waters of the subterranean river. It quite frightened me. I thought that we had left him behind for ever, and behold, borne by the current, he had made the awful journey with us, and with us had reached the end. His appearance also was dreadful, for he bore traces of having touched the pillar of fire, one arm being completely shriveled up and all his hair being burnt off. The features were, as I have said, sunken, and yet they preserved upon them that awful look of despair that I had seen upon his living face as the poor fellow was sucked down. Really the sight unnerved me, weary and shaken as I felt with all that we had gone through, and I was heartily glad when suddenly and without any warning the body began to sink just as though it had had a mission, which having been accomplished it retired, the real reason no doubt being that turning it on its back allowed a free passage to the gas. Down it went to the transparent depths, fathom after fathom we could trace its course, till at last a long line of bright air bubbles, swiftly chasing each other to the surface, alone remained where it had passed. At length these too were gone, and that was an end of our poor servant. Umslopogaas thoughtfully watched the body vanish. "What did he follow us for?" he asked. "'Tis an ill omen for thee and me, Macumazahn," and he laughed. I turned on him angrily, for I dislike these unpleasant suggestions. If people have such ideas, they ought in common decency to keep them to themselves. I detest individuals who make on the subject of their disagreeable presentiments, or who, when they dream that they saw one hanged as a common felon, or some such horror, will insist upon telling one all about it at breakfast, even if they have to get up early to do it. Just then, however, the others woke up and began to rejoice exceedingly at finding that we were out of that dreadful river and once more beneath the blue sky. Then followed a babel of talk and suggestions as to what we were to do next, the upshot of all of which was that, as we were excessively hungry and had nothing whatsoever left to eat except a few scraps of biltong, dried game flesh, having abandoned all that remained of our provisions to those horrible freshwater crabs, we determined to make for the shore. But a new difficulty arose. We did not know where the shore was, and, with the exception of the cliffs through which the subterranean river made its entry, could see nothing but a wide expanse of sparkling blue water. Observing, however, that the long flights of aquatic birds kept flying from our left, we concluded that they were advancing from their feeding grounds on shore to pass the day in the lake, and accordingly headed the boat towards the quarter whence they came, and began to paddle. Before long, however, a stiffish breeze sprang up, blowing directly in the direction we wanted, so we improvised a sail with a blanket and the pole, which took us along merrily. This done, we devoured the remnants of our biltong, washed down with the sweet lake water, and then lit our pipes and awaited whatever might turn up. When we had been sailing for an hour, Good, who was searching the horizon with the spyglass, suddenly announced joyfully that he saw land, and pointed out that, from the change in the colour of the water, he thought we must be approaching the mouth of a river. In another minute we perceived a great golden dome, not unlike that of St. Paul's, piercing the morning mists, and while we were wondering what in the world it could be, Good reported another and still more important discovery, namely, that a small sailing boat was advancing towards us. This bit of news, which we were very shortly able to verify with our own eyes, threw us into a considerable flutter. That the natives of this unknown lake should understand the art of sailing seemed to suggest that they possessed some degree of civilization. In a few more minutes it became evident that the occupant or occupants of the advancing boat had made us out. For a moment or two she hung in the wind as though in doubt, and then came tacking towards us with great swiftness. In 10 more minutes she was within 100 yards, and we saw that she was a neat little boat, not a canoe dug out, but built more or less in the European fashion, with planks, and carrying a singularly large sail for her size. But our attention was soon diverted from the boat to her crew, which consisted of a man and a woman nearly as white as ourselves. We stared at each other in amazement, thinking that we must be mistaken, but no, there was no doubt about it. They were not fair, but the two people in the boat were decidedly of a white as distinguished from a black race, as white, for instance, as Spaniards or Italians. It was a patent fact. So it was true, after all, and mysteriously led by a power beyond our own, we had discovered this wonderful people. I could have shouted for joy when I thought of the glory and the wonder of the thing, and as it was, we all shook hands and congratulated each other on the unexpected success of our wild search. All my life had I heard rumours of a white race that existed in the highlands of this vast continent, and longed to put them to the proof, and now here I saw it with my own eyes, and was dumbfounded. Truly, as Sir Henry said, the old Roman was right when he wrote "Ex Africa semper aliquid novi," which he tells me means that out of Africa there always comes some new thing. The man in the boat was of a good but not particularly fine physique, and possessed straight black hair, regular aquiline features, and an intelligent face. He was dressed in a brown cloth garment, something like a flannel shirt without the sleeves, and in an unmistakable kilt of the same material. The legs and feet were bare. Round the right arm and left leg he wore thick rings of yellow metal that I judged to be gold. The woman had a sweet face, wild and shy, with large eyes and curling brown hair. Her dress was made of the same material as the man's, and consisted, as we afterwards discovered, first of a linen undergarment that hung down to her knee, and then of a single long strip of cloth about 4 feet wide by 15 long, which was wound round the body in graceful folds and finally flung over the left shoulder, so that the end, which was dyed blue or purple or some other colour, according to the social standing of the wearer, hung down in front, the right arm and breast being, however, left quite bare. A more becoming dress, especially when, as in the present case, the wearer was young and pretty, it is quite impossible to conceive. Good, who has an eye for such things, was greatly struck with it, and so indeed was I. It was so simple and yet so effective. Meanwhile, if we had been astonished at the appearance of the man and woman, it was clear that they were far more astonished at us. As for the man, he appeared to be overcome with fear and wonder, and for a while hovered round our canoe but would not approach. At last, however, he came within hailing distance, and called to us in a language that sounded soft and pleasing enough, but of which we could not understand one word. So we hailed back in English, French, Latin, Greek, German, Zulu, Dutch, Sisutu, Kukuana, and a few other native dialects that I am acquainted with. But our visitor did not understand any of these tongues. Indeed, they appeared to bewilder him. As for the lady, She was busily employed in taking stock of us, and Good was returning the compliment by staring at her hard through his eyeglass, a proceeding that she seemed rather to enjoy than otherwise. At length the man, being unable to make anything of us, suddenly turned his boat round and began to head off for the shore, his little boat skimming away before the wind like a swallow. As she passed across our bows the man turned to attend to the large sail, and Good promptly took the opportunity to kiss his hand to the young lady. I was horrified at this proceeding, both on general grounds and because I feared that she might take offence, but to my delight she did not, for first glancing round and seeing that her husband, or brother, or whoever he was engaged, she promptly kissed hers back. "Ah," said I, "it seems that we have at last found a language that the people of this country understand." "In which case," said Sir Henry, "Good will prove an invaluable interpreter." I frowned, for I do not approve of Good's frivolities, and he knows it, and I turned the conversation to more serious subjects. "It is very clear to me," I said, "that the man will be back before long with a host of his fellows, so we had best make up our minds as to how we are going to receive them." "The question is how will they receive us?" said Sir Henry. As for Good, he made no remark, but began to extract a small square tin case that had accompanied us in all our wanderings from under a pile of baggage. Now we had often remonstrated with Good about this tin case, inasmuch as it had been an awkward thing to carry, and he had never given any very explicit account as to its contents, but he had insisted on keeping it, saying mysteriously that it might come in very useful one day. "What on earth are you going to do, Good?" asked Sir Henry. "Do? Why, dress, of course. You don't expect me to appear in a new country in these things, do you?" And he pointed to his soiled and worn garments, which were, however, like all Good's things, very tidy, and with every tear neatly mended. We said no more, but watched his proceedings with breathless interest. His first step was to get Alphonse, who was thoroughly competent in such matters, to trim his hair and beard in the most approved fashion. I think that if he had had some hot water and a cake of soap at hand he would have shaved off the latter, but he had not. This done, he suggested that we should lower the sail of the canoe and all take a bath, which we did, greatly to the horror and astonishment of Alphonse, who lifted his hands and ejaculated that these English were indeed a wonderful people. Umslopogaas, who, though he was, like most high-bred Zulus, scrupulously clean in his person, did not see the fun of swimming about in a lake, also regarded the proceeding with mild amusement. We got back into the canoe much refreshed by the cold water, and sat to dry in the sun, whilst Good undid his tin box and produced first a beautiful clean white shirt, just as it had left a London steam laundry, and then some garments wrapped first in brown, then in white, and finally in silver paper. We watched this undoing with the tenderest interest and much speculation. One by one, Good removed the dull husks that hid their splendours, carefully folding and replacing each piece of paper as he did so, and there at last lay, in all the majesty of its golden epaulets, lace and buttons, a commander of the Royal Navy's full dress uniform, dress sword, cocked hat, shiny patent leather boots and all. We literally gasped. "What?" we said. "What? Are you going to put those things on?" "Certainly," he answered composedly. "You see, so much depends upon a first impression, especially," he added, "as I observe that there are ladies about. One at least of us ought to be decently dressed." We said no more. We were simply dumbfounded, especially when we considered the artful way in which Good had concealed the contents of that box for all these months. Only one suggestion did we make, namely, that he should wear his mail shirt next his skin. He replied that he feared it would spoil the set of his coat, now carefully spread in the sun to take the creases out, but finally consented to this precautionary measure. The most amusing part of the affair, however, was to see old Umslopogaas's astonishment and Alphonse's delight at Good's transformation. When at last he stood up in all his glory, even down to the medals on his breast, and contemplated himself in the still waters of the lake, after the fashion of the young gentleman in ancient history, whose name I cannot remember, but who fell in love with his own shadow, the old Zulu could no longer restrain his feelings. "Oh, Bougwan," he said, "oh, Bougwan, I always thought thee an ugly little man and fat, fat as the cows at calving time, and now thou art like a blue jay when he spreads his tail out. Surely, Bougwan, it hurts my eyes to look at thee." Good did not much like this allusion to his fat, which, to tell the truth, was not very well deserved, for hard exercise had brought him down 3 inches, but on the whole he was quite pleased at Umslopogaas's admiration. As for Alphonse, he was quite delighted. "Ah, but monsieur has the beautiful air, the air of the warrior. It is the ladies who will say so when we come to get ashore. Monsieur is complete. He puts me in mind of my heroic grand—" Here we stopped Alphonse. As we gazed upon the beauties thus revealed by Good, a spirit of emulation filled our breasts, and we set to work to get ourselves up as well as we could. The most, however, that we were able to do was to array ourselves in our spare suits of shooting clothes, of which we each had several. All the fine clothes in the world could never make it otherwise than scrubby and insignificant. But Sir Henry looked what he is, a magnificent man in his nearly new tweed suit, gaiters, and boots. Alphonse also got himself up to kill, giving an extra turn to his enormous moustaches. Even old Umslopogaas, who was not in a general way given to the vain adorning of his body, took some oil out of the lantern and a bit of tow, and polished up his head ring with it till it shone like Good's patent leather boots. Then he put on the mail shirt Sir Henry had given him, and his moocha, and having cleaned up Inkosi-kaas a little, stood forth complete. All this while, having hoisted the sail again as soon as we had finished bathing, we had been progressing steadily for the land, or rather for the mouth of a great river. Presently, in all about an hour and a half after the little boat had left us, we saw emerging from the river or harbour a large number of boats, ranging up to 10 or 12 tons burden. One of these was propelled by 24 oars, and most of the rest sailed. Looking through the glass, we soon made out that the rowboat was an official vessel, her crew being all dressed in a sort of uniform, whilst on the half-deck forward stood an old man of venerable appearance and with a flowing white beard, and a sword strapped to his side, who was evidently the commander of the craft. The other boats were apparently occupied by people brought out by curiosity, and were rowing or sailing towards us as quickly as they could. "Now for it," said I. "What is the betting? Are they going to be friendly, or to put an end to us?" Nobody could answer this question, and not liking the warlike appearance of the old gentleman and his sword, we felt a little anxious. Just then Good spied a school of hippopotami on the water about 200 yards off us, and suggested that it would not be a bad plan to impress the natives with a sense of our power by shooting some of them if possible. This, unluckily enough, struck us as a good idea, and accordingly we at once got out our 8-bore rifles, for which we still had a few cartridges left, and prepared for action. There were 4 of the animals, a big bull, a cow, and 2 young ones, one 3 parts grown. We got up to them without difficulty, the great animals contenting themselves with sinking down into the water and rising again a few yards farther on. Indeed, their excessive tameness struck me as being peculiar. When the advancing boats were about 500 yards away, Sir Henry opened the ball by firing at the 3 parts grown young one. The heavy bullet struck it fair between the eyes, and crashing through the skull killed it, and it sank, leaving a long train of blood behind it. At the same moment I fired at the cow, and Good at the old bull. My shot took effect, but not fatally, and down went the hippopotamus with a prodigious splashing, only to rise again presently blowing and grunting furiously, dyeing all the water round her crimson, when I killed her with the left barrel. Good, who was an execrable shot, missed the head of the bull altogether, the bullet merely cutting the side of his face as it passed. On glancing up, after I had fired my second shot, I perceived that the people we had fallen among were evidently ignorant of the nature of firearms, for the consternation caused by our shots and their effect upon the animals was prodigious. Some of the parties in the boats began to cry out in fear. Others turned and made off as hard as they could, and even the old gentleman with the sword looked greatly puzzled and alarmed, and halted his big rowboat. We had, however, but little time for observation, for just then the old bull, rendered furious by the wound he had received, rose fair within 40 yards of us, glaring savagely. We all fired, and hit him in various places, and down he went, badly wounded. Curiosity now began to overcome the fear of the onlookers, and some of them sailed on up close to us, amongst these being the man and the woman whom we had first seen a couple of hours or so before, who drew up almost alongside. Just then the great brute rose again within 10 yards of their base, and instantly with a roar of fury made at it open mouth. The woman shrieked, and the man tried to give the boat way, but without success. In another second I saw the huge red jaws and gleaming ivories close with a crunch on the frail craft, taking an enormous mouthful out of its side and capsizing it. Down went the boat, leaving its occupants struggling in the water. Next moment, before we could do anything towards saving them, the huge and furious creature was up again and making open mouth at the poor girl, who was struggling in the water. Lifting my rifle just as the grinding jaws were about to close on her, I fired over her head right down the hippopotamus's throat. Over he went, and commenced turning round and round, snorting and blowing red streams of blood through his nostrils. Before he could recover himself, however, I let him have the other barrel in the side of the throat, and that finished him. He never moved or struggled again, but instantly sank. Our next effort was directed towards saving the girl, the man having swum off towards another boat, and in this we were fortunately successful, pulling her into the canoe, amidst the shouts of the spectators, considerably exhausted and frightened, but otherwise unhurt. Meanwhile the boats had gathered together at a distance, and we could see that the occupants, who were evidently much frightened, were consulting what to do. Without giving them time for further consideration, which we thought might result unfavourably to ourselves, we instantly took our paddles and advanced toward them, Good standing in the bow and taking off his cocked hat politely in every direction, his amiable features suffused by a bland but intelligent smile. Most of the craft retreated as we advanced, but a few held their ground, while the big rowboat came on to meet us. Presently we were alongside, and I could see that our appearance, and especially Good's and Umslopogaas's, filled the venerable-looking commander with astonishment not unmixed with awe. He was dressed after the same fashion as the man we first met, except that his shirt was not made of brown cloth, but of pure white linen hemmed with purple. The kilt, however, was identical, and so were the thick rings of gold around the arm and beneath the left knee. The rowers wore only a kilt, their bodies being naked to the waist. Good took off his hat to the old gentleman with an extra flourish, and inquired after his health in the purest English, to which he replied by laying the first two fingers of his right hand horizontally across his lips, and holding them there for a moment, which we took as his method of salutation. Then he also addressed some remarks to us in the same soft accents that had distinguished our first interviewer, which we were forced to indicate we did not understand by shaking our heads and shrugging our shoulders. This last Alphonse, being to the manner born, did to perfection, and in so polite a way that nobody could take any offence. Then we came to a standstill, till I, being exceedingly hungry, thought I might as well call attention to the fact, and did so, first by opening my mouth and pointing down it, then by rubbing my stomach. These signals the old gentleman clearly understood, for he nodded his head vigorously and pointed towards the harbour, and at the same time one of the men on his boat threw us a line and motioned to us to make it fast, which we did. The rowboat then took us in tow, and went with great rapidity towards the mouth of the river, accompanied by all the other boats. In about 20 minutes more we reached the entrance to the harbour, which was crowded with boats full of people who had come out to see us. We observed that all the occupants were more and less of the same type, though some were fairer than others. Indeed, we noticed certain ladies whose skins was of a most dazzling whiteness, and the darkest shade of colour which we saw was about that of a rather swarthy Spaniard. Presently the wide river gave a sweep, and when it did so an exclamation of astonishment and delight burst from our lips as we caught our first view of the place that we afterwards knew as Milosis, or the Frowning City, from Mi, which means city, and Losis, a frown. At a distance of some 500 yards from the river's bank rose a sheer precipice of granite, 200 feet or so in height, which had no doubt once formed the bank itself, the intermediate space of land now utilized as docks and roadways having been gained by draining and deepening and embanking the stream. On the brow of this precipice stood a great building of the same granite that formed the cliff, built on 3 sides of a square, the fourth side being open, save for a kind of battlement pierced at its base by a little door. This imposing place we afterwards discovered was the palace of the Queen, or rather of the Queens. At the back of the palace the town sloped gently upwards to a flashing building of white marble, crowned by the golden dome which we had already observed. The city was, with the exception of this one building, entirely built of red granite, and laid out in regular blocks with splendid roadways between. So far as we could see, also the houses were all one-storied and detached, with gardens round them, which gave some relief to the eye wearied with the vista of red granite. At the back of the palace a road of extraordinary width stretched away up the hill for a distance of a mile and a half or so, and appeared to terminate at an open space surrounding the gleaming building that crowned the hill. But right in front of us was the wonder and glory of Milosis, the great staircase of the palace, the magnificence of which took our breath away. Let the reader imagine, if he can, a splendid stairway, 65 feet from balustrade to balustrade, consisting of two vast flights, each of 125 steps of 8 inches in height by 3 feet broad, connected by a flat resting place 60 feet in length, and running from the palace wall on the edge of the precipice down to meet a waterway or canal cut to its foot from the river. This marvellous staircase was supported upon a single enormous granite arch, of which the resting place between the two flights formed the crown. That is, the connecting open space lay upon it. From this archway sprang a subsidiary flying arch, or rather something that resembled a flying arch in shape, such as none of us had seen in any other country, and of which the beauty and wonder surpassed all that we had ever imagined. 300 feet from point to point, and no less than 550 round the curve, that half-arc soared, touching the bridge it supported for a space of 50 feet only, one end resting on and built into the parent archway, and the other embedded in the solid granite of the side of the precipice. This staircase with its supports was, indeed, a work of which any living man might have been proud, both on account of its magnitude and its surpassing beauty. 4 times, as we afterwards learnt, did the work, which was commenced in remote antiquity, fail, and was then abandoned for 3 centuries when half finished, till at last there rose a youthful engineer named Radimas, who said that he would complete it successfully, and staked his life upon it. If he failed, he was to be hurled from the precipice he had undertaken to scale. If he succeeded, he was to be rewarded by the hand of the king's daughter. 5 years was given to him to complete the work, and an unlimited supply of labour and material. 3 times did his arch fall, till at last, seeing failure to be inevitable, he determined to commit suicide on the morrow of the 3rd collapse. That night, however, a beautiful woman came to him in a dream and touched his forehead, and of a sudden he saw a vision of the completed work, and saw too through the masonry, and how the difficulties connected with the flying arch that had hitherto baffled his genius were to be overcome. Then he awoke, and once more commenced the work, but on a different plan, and behold, he achieved it, and on the last day of the 5 years he led the princess his bride up the stair and into the palace, and in due course he became king by right of his wife, and founded the present Zu-Vendi dynasty, which is to this day called the House of the Stairway, thus proving once more how energy and talent are the natural stepping stones to grandeur. And to commemorate his triumph he fashioned a statue of himself dreaming, and of the fair woman who touched him on the forehead, and placed it in the great hall of the palace, and there it stands to this day. Such was the great stair of Milosis, and such the city beyond. No wonder they named it the Frowning City, for certainly those mighty works in solid granite did seem to frown down upon our littleness in their sombre splendour. This was so even in the sunshine, But when the storm clouds gathered on her imperial brow, Milosis looked more like a supernatural dwelling place, or some imagining of a poet's brain, than what she is, a mortal city carved by the patient genius of generations out of the red silence of the mountain side. End of chapter 11.